The judge froze mid-sentence when the homeless man said his name. Her hand trembled. The room went dead silent. What happened next stunned the entire courtroom. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The courtroom smelled faintly of fresh varnish and old tension. Wooden benches creaked under the shifting weight of anticipation, and the overhead lights buzzed with the static hum of expectation. It was supposed to be a routine hearing, just one in a long docket of city cases tied to property reclamation. The press had shown up for the case preceding it, involving a finance executive caught siphoning pension funds. No one expected this moment to leave a deeper mark. The courtroom doors opened slowly, without ceremony. A man shuffled in, hunched and deliberate, dragging every step as if his boots had absorbed too much of the street. His coat, once military green, hung in tattered layers, caked in city dust and time. His skin bore the etching of hard years, sun-scorched cheekbones, cracked lips, and the deep-set shadows of someone who hadn't slept indoors in days. Maybe weeks. Some in the gallery wrinkled their noses. Others leaned in, curiosity sharpening into discomfort. A young bailiff moved instinctively to intercept him, eyes narrowed, tone clipped. "Sir, this area is closed to the public. You can't—" Jonathan didn't flinch. He didn't argue or raise his voice. He simply held out a folded summons with fingers marked by grime and arthritis. "I'm not lost," he said. "This is my hearing. Name's Jonathan Miller." It was the way he said it, quiet, controlled, but with the distinct precision of someone who had once been used to giving orders, that made the room pause. The bailiff blinked, hesitated, then turned to confirm with the clerk. That's when the judge looked up. Rachel Whitman had seen her share of surprises in this courtroom. She had ruled over murder trials, custody battles, corporate fraud. But nothing hit her the way that name did. Jonathan Miller, the mentor who'd written her recommendation letter to Yale. The man who once said, "Justice only matters if it shows up for the forgotten." Her eyes met his, and for the briefest second, everything else receded. She didn't see the rags. She saw the ghost of a man who once walked proudly in full dress uniform beside her in a Veterans Day parade. Now he stood alone in a courtroom where no one clapped, no one saluted. She gripped the gavel, suddenly conscious of the weight it carried. Neutrality was the job. Empathy was the risk. He took his place before the bench without legal counsel, without an ally, only the small dignity he refused to abandon. And so began the hearing, not of property, not of zoning codes, but of how far a man could fall before the system remembered he was worth standing for. 10 years ago, Jonathan Miller's name had weight. It passed through the halls of City Hall like a stamp of credibility, uttered in board meetings, written in grant proposals, invoked at veterans events as a symbol of integrity and service. Before politics, he'd been Major Jonathan Miller, a logistics officer with commendations for battlefield coordination and humanitarian missions. His service record was immaculate. His transition to public service had felt inevitable. A soldier stepping into civic duty, swapping camouflage for a tie, still fighting for the forgotten. When the Veterans Housing Program launched, it was supposed to be his legacy. He believed in it, deeply. He'd walked the abandoned properties with architects, lobbied for funding, shaken the hands of the first vets who moved into refurbished homes. But belief is brittle when held against a system designed to punish dissent. The corruption began as whispers. Contractors billing for work never completed. Properties assigned to non-existent tenants. Jonathan noticed discrepancies, small at first, then blatant. Funds redirected, signatures forged. He followed the trail. It led straight to Judge Carlton Pierce, Whitman's mentor and the city's most respected judicial figure at the time, a man revered for his tough-on-crime rulings and philanthropic veneer. No one wanted to believe Pierce could be capable of graft. But Jonathan had the documents, the numbers, and the courage. He made his report. That same week, his home was raided under suspicion of fraud. Reporters camped on his lawn. Headlines branded him a thief, a disgrace, a cautionary tale. The irony was sickening. He had been the one who stood for truth, and yet the world believed the lie. He lost everything in waves: his security clearance, his position, his pension, then his marriage. His son, a college freshman then, stopped responding. Shame has a way of isolating even the innocent. He slept rough for the first time that winter. Under the Jefferson overpass, in a sleeping bag someone had left behind. He clutched his daughter's drawings like sacred texts, tiny crayon sketches of him in uniform, Daddy the hero, written in shaky handwriting. She'd passed away from leukemia just a year before the scandal. He kept her memory folded in plastic in the bottom of a tin box he never let out of his sight. Now, standing in court once more, he recounted it all, not in bitterness, but with the blunt precision of someone who had rehearsed this pain in silence for years. His voice didn't crack. It didn't need to. The facts, laid bare, were heavier than any plea. And still, the city's attorney stood, unflinching, citing zoning laws as if they existed in a vacuum, as if this man before them wasn't living evidence of a wound the city never wanted to acknowledge. "I've lived there," Jonathan said, voice unwavering, "because it's the only place that didn't throw me out." He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was asking to be seen. The gavel hadn't even struck noon before the courthouse became a hive of murmurs and rising heat. Reporters swarmed the hallways with phones pressed to ears, fingers darting across screens. Jonathan Miller's name, once erased from the city's conscience like graffiti on a government wall, was suddenly being whispered with urgency. By journalists, aides, even junior clerks who had no idea who he was that morning, but now spoke of him with the awe of rediscovery. Bits of truth surfaced, as they tend to do when someone finally dares to look. An old finance memo. A sealed audit flagged years ago and buried under bureaucratic silence. Bank statements unearthed by a freelance reporter who, 5 years earlier, had tried to pitch the story and been told it would damage trust in public institutions. Offshore accounts tied to Carlton Pierce, carefully routed through shell corporations in the Caymans and now laid bare through deathbed documents released posthumously by a whistleblower's estate. Every piece aligned like fragments of a long-buried mosaic, and in the center of it all was the name that had been burned, blackened, and now unexpectedly reborn: Jonathan Miller. Meanwhile, behind the heavy door of her chambers, Judge Rachel Whitman sat paralyzed, not with indecision, but with the suffocating weight of delayed conscience. The name on the docket had cracked something open in her that protocol could no longer shield. She stared at the old photo on her shelf, a snapshot from 15 years earlier, the day she passed the bar, standing beside Jonathan in a downtown cafe, his hand resting on her shoulder, beaming with that rare, open pride only true mentors wear without irony. He had believed in her, without hesitation, without condition. "You've got the kind of spine this system needs," he'd said. But when he needed hers, she'd vanished, like the rest. Now she saw the shape of her silence. It had contours, edges, a weight. She had hidden behind the code, behind professional detachment, telling herself it wasn't her case, that she couldn't intervene. But silence had consequences. Her inaction had cost a man his life, not in death, but in the slow erosion of dignity. When court resumed, the sound of her gavel wasn't just a procedural cue, it was a rupture. "The property shall not be demolished," she declared, each word carved from the stone of years unspoken. "And given the emergence of exculpatory evidence, I recommend a formal review of Mr. Miller's criminal case, effective immediately." The city attorney rose, voice clipped. "Objection.
This goes beyond the scope. No, she snapped, her voice like steel under flame. What went beyond the scope was letting a lie shape this man's fate for a decade. We stole his name. I won't let you take the last place he has to stand. The silence that followed wasn't stunned. It was reverent. Something in the room had shifted. Justice, long absent, had finally stepped through the door. The headline hit the networks like a thunderclap in a dry sky. Homeless hero vindicated. It ran beneath grainy courtroom footage and the still photo of Jonathan Miller standing alone in front of the judge's bench, eyes steady, back straight, wrapped in a coat that barely held together, but with dignity so intact it outshone any uniform he had ever worn. Within hours, the story gripped the nation. Morning talk shows debated the city's complicity. Evening anchors recited his name like a prayer for institutional redemption. Money flooded in, donations, job offers, speaking invitations. But Jonathan declined them all. For him, vindication wasn't a check or a podium. It was the quiet dignity of a sealed record correction notice stamped by the same courthouse that once condemned him. It was the return of his service medals, scratched but gleaming with renewed meaning, mailed back to him by the Pentagon with a formal letter of apology, signed in trembling regret. When a local Veterans Foundation offered him a newly furnished apartment in a restored historic building, he turned it down with a polite nod. "Let someone else have the bed," he said. "I've got work to do." Instead, he rolled up his sleeves, sometimes literally, and joined volunteers in gutting and rebuilding a rundown shelter for displaced vets on the east side of town. Hammer in hand, he didn't lead with speeches. He led with sweat, with patience, with a kind word to every man and woman who arrived carrying plastic bags and shame. He'd sit with them on the curb, eye to eye, and say, "You're not done. You're just waiting." Judge Whitman's resignation came days later. Her final address was brief, but no one in the courtroom doubted its sincerity. She stood at the same bench where Jonathan's name had brought her to stillness and read aloud, "Justice delayed is justice denied, and silence is not neutrality. It's complicity. I forgot that once. I won't forget again." Jonathan stood beside her, not as a guest of honor, but as a witness to the consequences of memory and the power of atonement. He never sought the spotlight, yet quietly, purposefully, he founded a legal aid clinic in a borrowed office downtown, a place where the forgotten could find someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be invisible. Veterans came in looking for food stamps, housing vouchers, or someone to listen without judgment. They left with something rarer, belief that the law could still be bent toward justice. And every Thursday evening, in a modest church basement that smelled of stale coffee and old hymnals, Jonathan lectured to first-year law students and pro bono interns. His words were measured but unwavering. The law isn't about rules. It's about people. Don't let anyone convince you justice is the same as order. It isn't. One serves the system, the other serves the soul. Those who heard him didn't just remember. They carried his words into courtrooms, into offices, into the moral decisions that shaped careers. Because in the end, Jonathan Miller hadn't just reclaimed his name. He had reshaped what it meant to bear it.